Good afternoon. Can you all hear okay? Yes? No? No, but there's tables closer to the gear. Yeah, we got a bunch of Baptists here. This is the primary microphone that we're going to be using. But if there's one thing I've learned after years of being here, it is don't move the microphone. So hence second microphone. If I haven't met you, my name is Rory Nave. I am the pastor here at First Baptist Church. We are delighted that you are here, even though the circumstances that might have brought you here are certainly not delightful. We're glad that you're here. With us today, offering expertise, is Dr. Richard Dew. Dr. Dew was a longtime member of the Oak Ridge community and a member of the First Baptist Church here. He is East Tennessee bred. He is educated at the University of Tennessee, where he did his med school career. He is a veteran. He was a medic in the military and served during the Vietnam War. He has served decades in Oak Ridge as a physician here. I think ending his career as a hospitalist. So we are delighted to have him here back at Oak Ridge First Baptist Church. He and his wife Jean have been in Gatlinburg for many number of years until a fire burned down their dream home, as he called it. So they are back in Knoxville, a little bit closer to us here in Oak Ridge. And as you will hear, I'm not going to steal his thunder or tell his story, because it's his story to tell. But he is well familiar with the concept of grief, with the work of grief, and what it means to go through it. So he has some very practical, lived advice about what you can do about it, what others can help you do about it, and what God can do about it. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Dew?
I see a lot of familiar faces here. Jean and I lived in Oak Ridge for 35 years. We were here for a long time. I spent some of the happiest days of my life here. And I spent some of the saddest days of my life here also. But I'll always be an Oak Ridger at heart. That's just me. I was asked to speak on grief and coping with grief. And I'll be talking from over 60 years experience as a practicing physician. Dealings with over 2,000 bereaved parents, and my own personal experiences. I want to try and cover first this week. First, we'll talk about what do we need to know about grief in general. Secondly, what can you do to help yourself? Then next week we'll talk about, well, what can you do to help other people? And thirdly, where does God fit in grief? And I've struggled with a lot of these things, and so we'll talk about those then. This afternoon, I want to talk about just grief in general. Then what can you do to help yourself get through grief? Next week, we'll talk about, I already mentioned, how you can help other people with their grief, and then where is God in grief? My introduction to grief came in 1992. It was a Sunday morning, 4:33 on a Sunday morning. I was on call, and my phone rang, and I answered the phone, and this strange voice said, "This is the Oliver Springs Police Department. You need to call the Jackson, Mississippi Police Department concerning a fatal accident involving Brad Dew." So I went and called the Jackson, Mississippi Police Department, and they said Brad has been killed in a car wreck. So came home, and Jean and I got busy calling friends and relatives, called Larry DuBois and told him that Brad had been killed. And then we went home and we got ready for the crowds that came rushing in. About 3 or 4 that afternoon, the house was full of people. Phone rang and I answered it, and it was some of Brad's friends from Mississippi. I said, Dr. Dew, something's wrong here. And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, we went down to the impound yard to get his gear out of his truck, and said, this truck is full of bullet holes. And I called and had a few choice words for the chief of police in Jackson, and it took 3 days, but they finally were able to determine, they determined that day that Brad had been murdered, and that had been missed by the police and had been missed by the coroner. So about 3 or 4 days later, the police got on the stick then, and they went and solved them, caught the guys. And it was 2 fellows who decided they were going to kill the next person coming down the street, and it just happened it was Brad going home from work. That was all rhyme and reason of it. Some of y'all, in fact, a lot of y'all knew Brad, I think. Brad was a neat guy. He was like that TV show, Everybody Loves Raymond. Everybody loved Brad. He was a really neat person, and he was everything I ever wanted to be as a young man and wasn't. He was good looking. He was a good athlete. He was smart, and girls just formed after him, which they never did me. But he also, when he had just finished his junior year at Millsaps College down in Jackson, Mississippi, he was a 2-time all-conference linebacker. He had just been selected for Phi Beta Kappa, and he was 21 years old, and he was my hero. At some point, grief will be part of most of our lives. I remember, some of y'all may have been in my Sunday school class. I taught a Sunday school class here for years and years and years. And one of the things I had said, I remember saying really often, and it said, my philosophy is life, a certain amount of good and a certain amount of bad happens to everybody. And I feel really uneasy because nothing really bad has ever happened to me. That came back to haunt me later on. What is grief? We talk about grief, but what is it? The dictionary says grief is deep mental distress brought about by a significant loss. And that sounds reasonable enough to me. We most often think of this in relation to the loss of a loved one. However, you'll see similar reactions, almost identical to these things we're going to be talking about today, to other closely held losses. Loss of a job, breakup of a long-term relationship, divorce, even the death of a beloved pet. We have a little dog now that I hope he outlives me. Things were different in the past. In the past, remember the widow wore black for a year? When I was in medical school, my dissecting mate was an Orthodox Jewish fellow. His father died, and he wore a black armband to medical school for a year. Why a year? Why not 6 weeks? Why not 6 months? What's so special about a year? Well, supposedly, in 1 year, all these little things have gone by. The little remembrance days, the Hanukkah, Christmas, Thanksgiving, the little small remembrance days that we all have, these have all passed. And unfortunately, a lot of people, including me, will wake up on the 366th day, and we don't feel a bit better than we did on the 365th day. How long does it take you to get over grief? how long does you're grieving? How long is it going to take? Well, one, getting over is a misnomer. You never really get over it. You do adapt to it. I like the term adapt, and I always use that. It's to me, it just fits it better than getting over. The other thing we say, when you're going to get over it, that just makes someone angry. So getting over it's not a good way of phrasing it. I did an article for a major medical journal on this topic about how long does it take to recover from grief. And there's not a lot of research, but there's enough. The first thing is it normally takes approximately 12 to 18 months to adapt to the death of an older parent. It takes 3 to 6 years to adapt to the death of a spouse. And it takes anywhere from 6 to 8 years to adapt to the death of a child. I couldn't find anything about how long it took to get over a best friend or a lifelong friend or something like that. My own personal observation seems to be somewhere around 2 to 4 years, but that's just totally unscientific. So how do you get through grief? What happens during grief? What's going on? When Brad died, I read everything I could to find out about grief. I had never heard of the stages of grief in medical school or college. The literature was full of it by the time Brad died. And there were all these stages of grief based on Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying. And compulsive me, I started out as, okay, I think at that time there's 7 or 8, maybe 9 stages of grief. And so I got through shock and denial. I think I got through 3, and then found out that now I'm starting to get 4 and 5 mixed in with 1 and 2, and it just didn't work the way they said. And so I sort of gave up on it then. I found it more useful. And they got to the point where they said you shouldn't use stages of grief. And I understand the idea, but most people know what you're talking about when you say that. And it does give you a rough idea about what happens and when it happens. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about 7 stages of grief, characteristics of grief, symptoms of grief, whatever you want to call it, but there's 7 of them in my book. They usually occur in some rough order, and they give you a general idea of what to expect and when to expect it. The first one is shock. It's the earliest symptom, and it's the most severe if the death was sudden and unexpected. People that just all of a sudden someone drops dead, you normally don't have a lot of shock in someone who has had a long-term chronic illness or a cancer that lasts for 3 or 4 years. But if it happens suddenly, these people go into what they call shock. Most of them described it as being stunned. They feel like they're stunned. I remember telling people I felt like I was floating around watching myself perform down here. A friend of mine told me that he came over 3 or 4 days after Brad was killed, and I was the perfect host. I met him at the door, I smiled, I let him in, I took him to the kitchen and got him some food and visited with him, and he was so proud that I was doing so well. And I was dying inside, but I was doing well as far as that went. If you ask me to remember what happened during that time, I couldn't tell you much of anything. All I remember, even at that time, were little flash frames. I could remember this, 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 and this. I just couldn't associate any of them. The second stage, if you want to use it, is denial. I don't like that because everyone who's taken Psych 101 knows all about you if they took psych. They know all about denial, and they can tell you everything about you. But basically, denial is an unconscious disconnect between their heart and their brain. You intellectually know your loved one's gone, but you just can't take it in. It's too much to swallow at one bite. Usually it's minor. I remember Jean, but I remember Jean, the first month or two, every so often she would just out of the blue say, I just can't believe it. I just expect him to come bouncing through that door. And that people would label that as denial. Much of what we call denial is minor. It's usually harmless, and it's often helpful. You need something, you can't sit there and dwell on what happened and how it happened. There's no rush in determining what to do with your loved one's clothing. That was sort of a thing around our place. Is Brad was not a clothes horse. If any of y'all knew him, jeans and a t-shirt was his uniform. They were usually clean, but his jeans were, many times there was as much fabric and patches as there was in the original jeans. And after he died, I couldn't bring myself just to take and throw it away. So we talked to some of his buddies in college. Hey, do you want some of Brad's clothes? And they said no. We took them to the Goodwill. They didn't want them. And but I couldn't just bring myself to throw them in the trash or burn them. So I put them in a big box and put them back in the back of my closet. They stayed there for 24 years. I wasn't in denial. I just felt uncomfortable getting rid of those clothes. And I told my other son that he was going to have to take care of them. And unfortunately, Mother Nature took care of it for him. When the wildfire came, it burned up our house in Gatlinburg, and it burned up the whole clothes in the closet too. So that really wasn't denial. The other thing I did, and didn't even think about it, but Brad always called me at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon from college, and I would stay home on Sunday afternoon and talk to him. After he was killed, I didn't go out for a while on Sunday afternoon. And, I knew that phone wasn't going to ring, but it just felt uncomfortable going, so I didn't. The general public deems lots of things in denial bad. The parents that want to change their child's room. Gene and I worked with Compassionate Friends for many, many years. And a lot of our friends did that. We had one lady, she kept a cake on the top of the refrigerator for something like 10 years. They didn't try to eat it, but she wouldn't throw it away because she'd fixed it right before he was killed. The wife who just can't stand apart for her husband's golf clubs or pipe, or the husband who just can't get rid of his wife's clothes. I'd say cut these people slack. If they're making progress toward getting back to normal and coping with life, what difference does it make? This seems to bother families, acquaintances, friends, more than it does them. So be careful about judging their denial. The next stage, a lot of people, well, I think most everybody has. I did in spades. I call it disorganization. It's a cushioning effect of shock wears off and denial doesn't work anymore. The survivor is left with the brutal fact that their loved one is not coming back. Their thought process is overload, and they're preoccupied with thoughts of the deceased, the details of how their death came about. Concentration is really difficult. This happens at a time when a lot of people have to go back to work. Most supervisors will cut you some slack, but they expect you to get back to a reasonable level of productivity fairly soon. I had problems when I went back to work. I waited 2 weeks. I went back to work after 2 weeks, and it was too soon. But I had real trouble remembering specific drugs and specific dosages of drugs. I'm sure that made all of you who were my patients then feel real confident. but I remember many times going to one of my partners, what's that blue pill we use to treat bronchitis, or that pink one, the 200 milligrams that we use for blood pressure? I just couldn't think of the name. What goes around comes around. I'm having that problem now, sometimes nowadays too. But then I should not have, but I did. A lot of women told me about getting disoriented when they went to the grocery store. It's almost like they got lost in the grocery store. I found a lot of times, we lived on the back side of the ridge from here, and I would come up and find myself somewhere in metropolitan Oliver Springs and not know how I got there. I was just there. And that happened more than once. I didn't tell Jean about it. I didn't want her to worry about me, but it happened a lot. But this is also a time when a lot of decisions have to be made. Settling life insurance, executing a will is doubly difficult when you're distraught and having trouble concentrating. It's often complicated by well-meaning friends giving troubling and disagreeing advice. Insomnia get to be a big problem during this time, and you have to be real careful with sedatives and alcohol. I took a lot of Benadryl. I was afraid to take prescription drugs. I took Benadryl, and melatonin wasn't a big thing then. If any of you are having trouble now, most doctors will prescribe something called trazodone. It's an antidepressant that's really weak and only has one side effect. It's not addictive. One side effect, and that's drowsiness, which is just what you want. So that's one thing that is safe to use. Eating problem. Eating gets to be a real problem for a lot of people during this. Jean and I were kind of equal opportunity employers. Jean is not a very large woman, and she lost 20 pounds. I'm not a very small man, and I gained 20 pounds. So between the two of us, we came out the same. Many people make bad decisions during this disoriented type time. I remember one couple, when we were working with the Compassionate Friends, came to me, and their son had been killed in a car wreck 3 weeks before, and they had sold their house. And I said, why did you sell your house? There were just too many memories there. 6 months later, they were desperate to get that house and those memories back. You have to be real careful about decisions you make early on. In fact, I don't give a lot of advice after someone dies, but I was doing this even before I worked with the Compassionate Friends. I would just start doing it with my patients, and I would say, don't make any irreversible decisions for 6 months to a year. And I did that when I was deciding whether I was going to stay in practice. I waited a year. So don't make a bunch of bad decisions during that time. Disorganization happens to most mourners to some degree or another, and there's little choice with it. That there's not any way to make it go away, but you just have to suck it up and keep plodding forward. And almost everybody comes out through it, and it normally only lasts for 3 to 6 months. and then you're kind of on your own. The next stage is the one that gets everybody. There are different names for it. I call it depression, loss, and loneliness. Um, it usually begins about 1 to 3 months out, and it's called by a lot of different names. Whatever you choose to label it, you've entered the longest and the harshest period of grief. There's nothing left to cushion you. Shock's worn off, denial doesn't work anymore. Many friends and relatives and acquaintances have drifted away. They don't know what to do or what to say, and they can't handle your continual grieving. You're beginning the painful process of learning to accept and live without your loved one there. Physical and emotional symptoms also start coming about this time. Fatigue, general aches and pains, stomach aches, indigestion, these sort of things start showing up. And if you go to the doctor, he may give you some well, he probably will give you. Doctors like to give medicines, sometimes to excess. I use the old example is if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you have is a prescription pad, everything looks like a pill. But anyway, these things start showing up at this time, and quite often it's just stress. And if you can take your doctor's word for it, usually you don't need a whole lot of medication. This whole process, though, seems like a repeated session of 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. You make a little progress, but you lose a lot of progress too. You're doing pretty well, and then you're blindsided when they play your favorite song. Pachelbel's canon always got me. I always call that Brad's song. I love to hear it. And I played it over and over again. I don't know why. Well, I don't know why too. But you hear a voice that's so familiar it stalks you cold until you find out it's not theirs. You're in the checkout line, and someone right ahead of you have the same height, same carriage, same hairstyle, until you find out, no, it's not them. Any of y'all ever heard of grief spasms? I always call them grief. You get these. You're getting along fine, and then all of a sudden, one of these things happens that just knocks the props out from under you. And you're suddenly plunged all the way back into the first part of this bad stage of grief, and you're having to work your way through it all over again. And there are numerous real losses that you have to deal with from time to time. In the case of a young adult, you have the bittersweet pain when their friends start to graduate and move on, get married, have children, and your plans for having grandchildren that are not going to ever come. Your plans to travel with your spouse, and you're not going to get to do that. To name just a few, you still have to cope with all these special days we talked about earlier too. The one that gets most people the most, did us, is what do you do on the day they die? What do you do on the day your child died? That's the first 2 or 3. Later, that's not that big a problem, but early on, that can be a real problem. It bugged Gene and I. Brad was a big deer hunter, so we decided, well, we're going to go ride around Caged Cove and look at the deer. And they had a petting zoo over in Sevierville where you could go pet the deer. We did. Didn't help. Finally, I guess it was the 3rd year, we were trying to decide, what are we going to do this June 7th? And it hit me. I said, Brad was always on my case. He said, you always say you want to do something, and then you get busy at the office and don't do it. why don't you do what you say you want to do? And I told Sheena, I said, we have been in East Tennessee for 25 years. We always said we were going to climb Mount LeConte. This was before we started hiking, too. We were not in shape. But I said, this year we're going to climb Mount LeConte. So we parked one car on one side, one car on the other side, and we went up one side of the mountain. And when we got to the top of the mountain, I could almost hear Brad saying, way to go, Dad, I'm proud of you. When we came back down, I learned that therapy through fatigue is tough. But anyway, it worked. Any of you ever heard the term visitations? About people having visitations? I had not paid much attention to that. There were some people with the Compassionate Friends who actually wrote a book about it. But this is about the time when visitations happen, and there's been a lot of study done on those. And the interesting thing is that they very seldom occur beyond the first year of the death. If you're going to have one, you usually have it within the first year. And some comes as incredibly realistic dreams, totally unexpected. But here's this dream. Usually the loved one appears, reassures the survivor that everything is okay, and then leaves. Others are more simple dreams. You just dream of them, which, but have no obvious meaning. And many people experience an overwhelming sense of presence. Some people say they smell their wife or their daughter's perfume. That hasn't happened to me. Some of them just have some feeling of contact. Most of us wish something like this would happen, but wishing doesn't make it so, and it never has for me. The next thing you reach, and I don't know if this is a legitimate turning point, but that I say it is I call it a turning point. Calling this a time in your grief journey a turning point is probably a little over the top, but there's no definite moment. There's no clear turning point. It creeps up on you. Sleep comes a little bit easier. The empty feeling, that bothered me for a couple of years, the empty feeling in the pit of your stomach gradually fades away. Laughter comes more naturally, and you don't feel guilty after you do it. Sleep comes easier. Occasionally, you can even see some things positively. I had a hard time doing that for a long time. You can and you can focus. You start getting where you can focus on their life instead of focusing on their death. That's all you think about for a long time, and you can start focusing on their life. You can remember some good times and smile, which doesn't come very early. And you tentatively start making plans for the future, the very near future, but yet the future still. You still get blindsided, but not as often. And these flashback and grief spasms still happen, but many times for no apparent reason. They just out of the blue, there it comes and you feel rotten. But they're less frequent, they don't knock you as deep, and they don't last as long. And I always say you're starting to live again. So that's sort of the general course most of us follow to some degree or another. Very, very loosely, but at least gives you an idea of what might be coming or so. What can you do to help yourself? That's what I want. If you're going through grief right now, this is something I'd like you to take with you when you leave today. From the moment your loved one dies, you have embarked on a journey. I call it a grief journey. It's a trip that was unplanned and unwanted, but unavoidable. and it will probably be one of the hardest things you've ever tried to do. The operative word, though, is do. You're not going to get through grief sitting back waiting for it to go away. That just doesn't happen. You have to do something actively to do it. Grief counselors always say you got to do your grief work. If any of y'all ever been to a grief counselor, well, they're going to tell you got to do your grief work. And the thing, if you want to really confuse them, say, what is grief work? And I looked for a long time in many books before I found a suitable definition, and it's almost 2 pages long. So, but you got to do it. You're sad, you're depressed, and you're fatigued, and you want to lay down and quit. But you have to keep on with your grief work. You can't lay down and quit. The first and most important thing you have to do is to make a conscious decision. And I did this really early, and I just said, with God's help, I will not let this Brent's death destroy my life. And I said that to myself many, many times. But if you keep doing that, eventually you'll convince yourself that it's not. It just takes a while to do it. We control grief better when we break it into controllable segments. Take it one day at a time and subdivide that day into as many pieces as you need to. Initially, try to get from breakfast to lunch, from lunch to dinner, and from dinner to bedtime. Don't skip to tomorrow. Deal with this day, this hour, this minute, this moment. Spend some time alone each day. This is your time. So pray, meditate, read, write in a journal, but get some time off by yourself each day. Do something social each day. Just call a friend if you need to. And don't wait for them to call you. They always say, if you need anything, just let me know. Well, let them know. If have a friend over for tea and talk, go for a walk with them. That can be real helpful. And it gets rid of a little energy too. Try to do something physical each day. A brisk walk or a jog can burn off a lot of adrenaline and pin up emotion. We had a fellow in our support group, a good friend of mine, and his grief counselor told him he needed to start jogging. And he did, and he said it did more good than anything else he did during the whole, the grief counselor did for him was get him started jogging, but it really made a big difference in his getting along. Try to get enough sleep. I mentioned before, insomnia is common. Do the simple things first. Drink a glass of milk, avoid caffeine after lunch, all the common sense thing we always do, whatever works best for you. But try to, if sleep is still elusive, try taking the medications I mentioned. But be careful about sedatives and tranquilizers. You don't want to fool with those. A grief counselor can be helpful if they're good. How do you know if they're good? Well, if you've been working with them for a month or so and you don't feel any better, probably you need to move over and find another grief counselor. So, and quite often, if you're in a support group or something, some people there will have dealt with one and said, this one really helped me a whole lot. The thing I think that is most personally think will help the most, and a bunch of you, if I don't have too many men here, they don't like this. But going to a support group. I have a confession. For many years, I poo-pooed support groups. I thought they were for weenies and woosses who couldn't handle their own problems. And that was weird because I insisted all of my alcoholic patients go to AA, which is a quintessential support group. And the people who went there did much better than the ones who didn't. But that was me. Uh, when Brad died, I found that I couldn't manage my own problems, just like the one I thought they were. Um, about 2 weeks after Brad died, was killed, we got a call from a lady in Knoxville. We didn't know her. She had read about Brad in the paper, and she sent you a letter, didn't she? It sent Gene a letter, and her son was, if you had told you the story, you probably remember it, had been killed on the UT campus, had been murdered there. And she had gotten active in the Compassionate Friends and said they really helped. And basically they saved our lives. This helped us more than anything else. Is going there was the smartest thing, or perhaps the most fortunate thing we ever did. There's an excellent Compassionate Friends chapter in Knoxville. So if any of you have lost a child, and the other thing, the Compassionate Friends are for parents and grandparents of who have lost children. And children ranges all the way from miscarriages to 60 years old. We have a lot of women there who have lost a child who was in their 60s. They all seem to be helped by it. So it's something that can really be helpful. The one in Knoxville meets at Second United Presbyterian, not that second, no, it's Middlebrook, Middlebrook Pike Methodist Church. I think it's Middlebrook Pike United Methodist Church, and they meet on the second Sunday at 2 p.m. If you go to CompassionateFriends.org and go to the national office, they'll tell you where the nearest one is and all the contact numbers. So it's a good thing to do. They also have lots of material there that you can get that you can't get most anywhere else. So they have lots of resources there that you can get. A grief support group will not fix your problems. The problems of a lost loved one is unfixable. They can't be fixed, but it will help us adapt to our new reality. My observation has been that people who attend support groups in general tend to adapt more fully and more quickly than the people who decide they're going to go it alone. So keep that in mind. How do grief? I'm going to talk a lot about grief support groups because I think they're really, really important. And how do they help? It helps in several ways. Many acquaintances that you have, many in your family, have no idea what you're going through, particularly if you lost a child. But Brad was the first. Well, Brad died 6 weeks after my father, but my father and Brad were the first two people in our immediate family who had died in my lifetime. So a lot of people don't have any idea what's going on with them. When you go to a Compassionate Friends or go to a support group meeting, everybody there is in the same boat. They know what you're going through, and they're not as apt to say and do things that anger you so much. They provide a safe place to talk about your loved one. How many times do you find that you start talking about your loved one who died and they sort of drift away really quick? It's not a real good conversational piece. One of the major tools in recovering from or adapting to grief is talking. You talk your way through grief. You don't medicate your way through grief. After 2 or 3 months, most of our friends are tired of talking. Their friends, acquaintances, and members, they've moved on with their lives, and they don't know what to do, don't know what to say, and they're tired of listening. We keep saying the same thing and asking the same questions, and they sort of move on. The story's told of Jacqueline Kennedy. After Jack Kennedy was killed, for three or 4 months afterwards, anybody she could buttonhole, she would get off to the side and spend 30 minutes or an hour going over everything that happened that day in intimate detail with them. And she did this time and time and time again. But a good friend of mine in the Compassionate Friends, he said when his son, when Tommy was first killed, he said, you don't want to sit by me on a plane because I'll get the topic to him and I'll talk for an hour or two. He said, now I only tell it when somebody asks and I can do it in 10 minutes. It gradually improves as time goes by. The group shares methods that they found that to be helpful in different situations. A lot of times what do I do here? I don't want to do something wrong, make somebody feel bad. But somebody else in the group has had that same problem. They'll be glad to talk to you about it. It's really easy to slide into the woe is me, my loss is the worst one in the whole world. And you feel that way sometimes. You realize pretty quickly once you go to a meeting that your loss is bad, the worst one you've ever had. But so are the losses of everybody else there. And again, you're all in the same boat. The group is a very good place to grieve. How many times have you broken down crying and everybody gets all upset about it? They think, oh, I've committed the unpardonable sin. I've made them cry, made them remember. We didn't remember. That's all we do is remember. And we cry mainly because you've mentioned their name and nobody else will. So it's okay to mention their name. And at a support group, you can talk all you want, you can cry all you want, and nobody gets upset at all. If you start crying, someone will hand you a tissue, but no one will say, there, don't cry. This one I hesitated to do. You can express whatever you think deserves. You can express anger at whatever and whoever you think deserves it. Insensitive friends, the justice system, doctors, lawyers, or even God. No one will correct you and chide you and say, that's bad. You can tell how angry you are with your deceased spouse because he left you with no insurance, or your child because they overdosed. We're sad and we're sorry, but we're really upset that they did that. We taught them better. One member of our group was really distressed and thought she was going crazy, and came to me and said, could you help me get a psychiatrist? And I said, well, why? She said, I think I'm going crazy. I said, well, why? And this lady lived out in the country, and she said, well, I go out behind my house late at night, and I scream my daughter's name over and over and over again. And that sounded a little odd to me too. And I said, well, could I bring this up at our Compassionate Friends meeting? I don't care. And so the next month when we had our meeting, I disguised the name to hide the innocent, but told the story. And when I told about this, immediately 3 other women popped up and said, and they looked perfectly normal, said, I do that all the time. One of them did it exactly. She lived out in the country. If you lived out in the country, you went out in the backyard and did it. If you lived in town, one of them worked, and so she screamed in the car on the way to work. I often wondered about the person next to her at the stoplight, but I didn't ask. And the other one waited till her husband went to work, and then she would go to her daughter's picture and bang on the wall and scream her name over and over again. Uh, when we talked about that at the meeting, uh, almost all the women had done something similar to that in some shape, form, or fashion. And oddly enough, I think it shows how good we are at handling grief. None of the guys had or would admit to it. But this is one thing where a grief support group really helped a lot. And the lady she was convinced she wasn't going crazy then after all these normal ladies doing the same thing. So she canceled her appointment. Some mothers, and this sounds strange, some mothers, well, let me just go over. Bereaved people do a lot of strange activities that seem different and sometimes downright weird, particularly when you get into dealing with children. But it's perfectly normal for the situation. But I don't know how many of our mothers keep their child's clothing in a sealed bag so that they can still smell their child's scent. I never thought of smelling what my child smelled like, but this is a big thing with a lot of women and compassionate friends. I knew a lady when I was here in Oak Ridge, and she ate lunch every day at Luby's cafeteria. Y'all remember Luby's? She ate every day at Luby's cafeteria, and she talked throughout the whole meal to her husband, who had been dead for 3 years, which seemed really strange until you got to know the lady, and she ran 2 large businesses here in town very well. And so I didn't ask her about it or make any comment on it. And a lot of people, I never visited the funeral the cemetery very often. A lot of people do and talk to their child. Jean and I kind of get this need to go sometimes, and I go, and when I get there, don't know what to do and don't stay very long, but I feel better after I have. So this is another thing that's kind of a little different between people. Talking to people who have made some real progress in their adapting, many of them will tell you that they started getting a lot better after they were able to help somebody else. And a grief support group gives you lots of fodder for people who need to be helped. And if you're at a meeting and someone is having real problems, it's really easy to go talk to them about what their problem is, particularly if you've had that problem and you can say, I remember when I was doing that. That's one thing you never hear at a Compassionate Friends meeting, and I bet you've heard this from other people, is I know just how you feel. I've never heard a compassionate friend say that to another. I've heard them say, I remember when I was at that point, this is how I felt. But they never say that. But you know what they're going through, and you can talk to them about it. And this is a whole group of people that you can use to try to help along. And a lot of people, that becomes their ministry. As James spent a lot of time after the meetings. You didn't chime in at the meetings too much, but she stayed after the meetings lots of times to talk to different ladies who had been having problems. So this gives you an opportunity to do something worthwhile, and you're blessed, but so are they. So it's something that you can do. In addition to the support group, in addition to giving you opportunities to help and to helping other people and let them meet you, the one thing that they get that they really have trouble getting anywhere else is hope. They can get hope at a Compassionate Friends meeting. They see encouraging role models. They see people who back when were as bad off as they are, and they're now positive, happy, normal individuals. And when you see that, you think, gosh, I bet I could do that too. So it's really helpful to do there. One other thing that I found, as I said, I got more probably from our support group than anything else. But one other thing that I found helped me a lot, and that is we all, when a loved one dies, particularly if it's sudden and if it's tragic, what do we always ask? We always ask why. I had one lady, and y'all would know her if she's dead and gone now, but she and her husband were my patient. He came in for a stress test and had he had a normal stress test, and he dropped dead on his way back to the waiting room. Totally unexpected. It wasn't unexpected to me. I knew he was having heart trouble, and I told him he needed to have a cath, and he refused to do it unless he had an abnormal stress test. Took the stress test and arrested during the stress test. But for the next 4 or 5 months, she was in every week or two to see me for a formal visit, and the only thing she asked is, why? Why did this happen? And I could tell her why. He had a 95% blockage of one of his major coronary arteries. But that wasn't the question she was asking. She kept saying, but why? He was such a good man. And all these reasons why he should not have died. And we hear this all the time, and it's an existential question. They want to know, where in the great scheme of things does this fit in? And I don't know. And I decided very early. I asked why for maybe a week or 10 days. And I thought, I'm not going to get an answer to this, so I'm going to quit asking. Maybe I'm asking the wrong question. And maybe the right question is, given the fact that this terrible thing has happened, what am I going to do with it? And I found that a good start. And then about that same time, about the time Brad was killed, any of y'all ever heard of Rabbi Harold Kushner? Rabbi Harold Kushner had just published a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And I read it. I disagreed with 99% of his theology. I did not like his theology. However, tucked away in the back of the book were 2 or 3 pages that changed my life. Here, this book that I had no use for except for those 2 or 3 pages. And what he said, and he said, when these terrible things happen, they have no meaning at all. They just happen. And whatever meaning that's going to come to their death and their life is going to be from what those of us left behind bring to it. And he stated it rather dramatically. He said, you will inevitably create a memorial in memory of your lost loved one. And it will be a memorial to good or a memorial to evil. And if you become an apathetic, bitter, negative, hurtful individual, that's your memorial. If, on the other hand, you become a more positive, helpful, empathetic person, that's your memorial. And from the time I read that, I said, that made sense to me. And it actually became my mantra. I've dedicated my writing. I've dedicated my working with bereaved people. I dedicated my working with uninsured people that I work with in Sevierville, and giving talks to church groups. These are my memorial to Brad. I'm convinced that one of the most powerful forces in coping with grief is to do good things to bring meaning to us and to our loved one's life. Ask yourself, given the fact that this terrible thing has happened, what can I do to bring meaning to their life? What will be your memorial? Thank you.